When it comes to recognizing the Church of God, one easy-to-read sign is the keeping of the Sabbath. We know from the Old Testament that the Sabbath was a sign between Israel and God, for example, Exodus 31. But the Sabbath, even today, is something that we acknowledge is different than from what most of the world does, even most of the religious world. In observing the Sabbath, we know that there are some things that are required of the day that go along with our keeping it. Things such as it being a holy convocation, another is resting from our customary work, another is worshiping God. But when it comes to the New Testament, there is a perspective that Jesus has that might have us changing our perception a bit on what we think is right versus what we think is wrong on the Sabbath day. To begin, I'd like us to turn to Mark chapter 3. Mark 3. This is an account of the Pharisees denying Jesus as the Messiah, as well as an example of their messed up approach when it comes to God's law. I'll first read through verses 1 through 6, and then we'll go back and focus on the key message. Mark 3, and starting in verse 1. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He'd stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. In this passage, Jesus performs a healing on the Sabbath, of which the Pharisees were, of course, opposed to the idea of doing. In their view, the Sabbath day was, in general, not for this kind of activity. Jesus, of course, knew that they were watching him, and thus does this healing essentially to make a point to them. But it wasn't the healing that was the point necessarily. It's what he said prior to that is the big takeaway here. He asked them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" This is the phrase I want us to think about today. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? I think often we can have a view of the Sabbath that is in keeping with Deuteronomy or Exodus, which isn't wrong, but this may not be quite a complete view of the Sabbath day. And I'm not saying that we don't necessarily already have a well-rounded view, but it's at least something to consider, and is my point today. Of course, I don't think anyone would suggest that we would have a view of the Sabbath day such as the Pharisees had, with all of their made-up traditions and restrictions on what could and couldn't be done. All of the additional things they placed on the day actually did make it a burden on most people, which is not what God intended. But there is still something to learn from this exchange in Mark for us here today that I think is important to consider. In verse 4, Jesus asked, "Is it lawful?" He's testing the Pharisees to ask, is this something that is okay or not? Basically, is it right or wrong to do good is what he's asking. They didn't have an answer. Because if they said yes, well, then why did they ignore the man with the withered hand? And if they said no, then they're stuck because they themselves do good on the Sabbath in terms of preaching and fellowshipping and going to the synagogue, worshiping God. These are all things that are good to do. They don't deny that doing good is not wrong, but they place their own righteousness ahead of mercy and love. And this is in part where they were going wrong. The issue was they ignored empathy and kindness, and in its place, they saw only their religious observance and rituals of the Sabbath as their chief command or duty. Now, by Jesus asking, is it lawful to do good or to do harm, he's giving them two options. But really, there's a third option that the Pharisees probably wanted to hear, and that is to do nothing. He didn't offer them a neutral option where they could say, yes, the Sabbath is for doing nothing. It's just resting, worshiping God, really no other action is allowed, that's it. But let's think about this. Jesus asks, is it lawful to do good? And then he heals someone. Jesus did not have to do that right there and then. Furthermore, while the act of healing the man's hand was good, he went out of his way to do it. Notice the man was not coming up to Jesus to ask him for healing, from what we can tell. In verse 3, Jesus says to the man, "Come here," so it was not the other way around. It was also not the case that the man was dying, and Jesus had to rush in to save him. He's just there, and Jesus calls him to himself. Now, in part, he certainly did this to prove to the Pharisees a point, but what exactly is the point that he's proving? Let's go to a very similar account in Luke, Luke 14, verses 1 through 5. This is almost the same story, but Luke adds something additional. So let's actually start at verse 3 of Luke 14. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And here's the bit I'd like us to focus on. Verse 5, "And he said to them, 'Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out?' And they could not reply to these things." So something interesting is here in Luke's account. Jesus calls this man to himself, heals him, and sends him on his way. He then teaches the Pharisees a lesson, starting at verse 5, with this example of a son or an ox that has fallen into a well. But hang on a minute. That's not at all what he just did with this man. He did not rescue someone in need of immediate danger or concern. He did not find himself in a position where he had to take care of this situation, such as an ox or a son falling into a well. He did not find himself with no other option but to heal this man. Now, I do believe he pointed this out to shame the Pharisees in saying that they will actually do something good on the Sabbath that appears outside the bounds of what the Sabbath allows. But this example Jesus gives does not at all appear to prove to the Pharisees that healing on the Sabbath, when it is not absolutely necessary, was okay to do. The example that he gives is about a pressing need, a life-threatening situation, something that can't wait. But that's not what occurred with this man that he healed. What difference do you think for the man would it have made for Jesus to wait until, say, 5:30 p.m. after the Sabbath to heal him then? Probably no difference. The man would have been the same. So then, what is the lesson? We might be tempted to say, well, he went ahead and healed him, though, in order to teach the Pharisees a lesson. And that he did, but there's an issue with it only being that. And that is that he still did it. He still did the act of healing, despite it not having to be done immediately in this situation for the sake of the man. Often and maybe you've heard of the saying, ox in a ditch. This phrase is normally given when a situation comes up on the Sabbath where we need to take care of someone or something that requires our immediate attention. And we might say, well, it's okay. I mean, this is an ox in a ditch situation. It's kind of a one-time thing. God understands. No doubt this is taken from, of course, from this example that we read in Luke 14. I think we tend to really only think of the ox in a ditch situation as an exception to the Sabbath rules. And that is, in fact, how the Pharisees viewed it, but that's not how Jesus saw it. He did not give the ox in a ditch example to show it as an exception to the Sabbath, but rather he likened it to something that is good. In fact, something that actually should be done. Allow me to back this up. In Mark 2, in verse 25, Jesus responds to the Pharisees' accusation about the disciples plucking grain on the Sabbath with the story of David eating the showbread that was not lawful for him to eat, but for only the priests. He does not condemn this action, but rather he says this statement, and I'll just read this one to you. This is verse 27 of Mark 2. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What's he mean here? Jesus is explaining that the needs of man do not get eclipsed by the Sabbath day. When someone has a need, whether immediately pressing or not, it is not wrong to meet that need on the Sabbath. That is both the context and the intent of the verse in Mark 2. It is not wrong to assist or care for someone on the Sabbath day. And I think this is what Jesus is showing the Pharisees as the lesson here. If something comes up where you can help your fellow man, do not neglect to do that good simply because it is the Sabbath day. And think or say something like, I'm sorry, I must ignore your need for now because it is more important for me to rest fully and do nothing on this day. That mindset we must not have. I'm not saying that we should go out into the world, neglect the holy convocation that is the Sabbath, and start evangelizing people through good works efforts that have nothing to do with preaching the gospel, but that simply are just nice things to do for humanity. Jesus did not suggest this either. However, I do think it is fair to say, based on his example, that it is not wrong to do some good on the Sabbath day, even if it didn't fall on you and you had no other choice but to take care of it immediately, such as the ox in a ditch situation or saying has often been interpreted to mean. In other words, you might need to help one of your brethren with, and I'll let you fill in the blank, on the Sabbath day. And in doing so, you showed them mercy, love, and compassion. This is commendable before God. There's one more similar account I want to look at, and that is in Luke 13. And we'll start from verse 14. It says, prior to this, that Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath when he healed this woman from her disability. So starting in verse 14 of Luke 13, verse 14. But the ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, there are 6 days in which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, not on the Sabbath day. Then the Lord answered him, you hypocrites, do not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to water it? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? Jesus pointed out that the Pharisees would even place taking care of their own animals over taking care of this woman, who, incidentally, as it says, was a child of Abraham. So she was one of their own even, yet they ignored her because it was the Sabbath day, and they decided that things like this should not be done. And that is the point, I think, that Jesus was making to the Pharisees. They neglected their brethren, such as also the man with the withered hand, simply because it was the Sabbath day. They placed not only rest from working on the Sabbath as a priority, but also an artificial rest or break from showing mercy and love to their brethren. In Mark 3, when the man with the withered hand was there, it says that they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. They knew Jesus could heal him. They knew he could do that. But they themselves weren't about to do anything for this man when it came to at least attempting to heal him, mostly because it was the Sabbath day. They should have rejoiced that this man was finally healed from his infirmity. Rather, they only sought to kill him because he did what appeared to them to be too much on the Sabbath. They placed above all else their observance over the need of someone else, and this was not to be so. When Jesus looked around at them in anger, as it says in verse 5 of Mark 3, it really shows God does not desire that we completely ignore doing good to someone because we must keep the Sabbath, and that person should not interfere with that. That's the mindset that Jesus was condemning. We do rest from our customary work, but we do not rest from loving our neighbor as ourselves.